Hello everybody, my name is Nick Starwind and welcome to another review where we dive into the history of media and piece together the whys, whens and hows of this popular product. As always, remember to like, share, subscribe and check out my channel for more video goodness, including stuff not involving Thomas the Tank Engine. And if you can, spare some change, Governor, by donating through the links below. Now this time we'll be detouring from our most popular topic and looking into the ever popular and sometimes controversial world of comic book movies, with one of my favourite comic book movies adapted from my second favourite comic book series, which, despite falling into obscurity, is a cult among fans and has been rated as one of the best adaptations based on a comic book of all time. So without making this another 30-minute video, let's celebrate its 10th anniversary and talk about Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was released in 2010 and directed by Edgar Wright of Hot Fuzz and Shaun the Dead fame, making this at the time his fourth movie while taking a break from the Cornetto trilogy, and in my opinion before taking a nosedive in quality. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World takes place in Toronto, Canada, and tells the story of, well, Scott Pilgrim and his precious little life.
He said it!
As he hangs out with friends and plays in a band called the Sex Bombs until one day he meets a girl called Ramona Flowers, and his life spirals into utter chaos of dealing with adulthood and having to overcome the obstacles in his new relationship, which is the main selling point of the film as he must defeat Ramona's 7 evil exes, who are all inspired by comics, anime, video games, or fashion trends of the time. Looking at you, Patel. The film is filled to the brim with video game and other pop culture references of the time, giving it a very stylistic comic book feel that would make Deadpool blush. Sometimes being so meta, you don't know what is real to the world, in Scott's head, or just a stylistic choice, which in many different ways helps to push the story along, where a simple character or location introduction can be done with a simple comic name box. There are even a large amount of comic book celebrities in this. You have your post-Human Torch pre-Captain America Chris Evans, pre-Captain Marvel Brie Larson, post-Superman Brandon Roth, and the best Punisher of all time, Thomas Jane, and a collection of other amazing actors. Whoever was the casting director of this film deserves an award for how spot on they were, especially casting Michael Cera and Mary Elizabeth Winstead for the leading roles. It was like they stepped off the page, it was that good. I consider this film to be the peak of Edgar Wright's directing prowess, using his unique style of direction that made him so recognisable back in the day. Similar to how we can tell whether we're watching a Wes Anderson or a Tim Burton movie, it drips with his talent every minute on the screen. Sadly, despite the ultimate praise from critics and fans for its beautiful presentation and amazing story, it failed to make its $85 million budget back, only making $48 million in the box office, which, in my opinion, is due to the lack of push and obscurity of the original comics. So despite it having Edgar Wright's name attached to it, it wasn't enough to bring in audiences and fell into obscurity, only generating a cult following in the coming years. But of course, where you get comic book movies, there's the great debate that follows swiftly afterwards, and that is, which is better, the comic or the movie? Well, let's look at the original. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is based off a 6 graphic novel series created by Brian Lee O'Malley, and published by Oni Press from Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life in 2004 to Scott Pilgrim's Finest Hour in 2010. The comics are a lot more in depth than the movie, with a lot centering on the general daily lives of the characters and talking about more of the difficulties when becoming an adult and trying to get your life in order while balancing everything else out. Which, as someone who was in their teens when the series started, was incredibly relatable to me. More so that when I first read it, that I had just started university, so there was a lot of similarities between mine and Scott's life, excluding the Dragon Ball Z fights of course. When the first book was released in 2004, Oni Press was so confident in its success that they immediately went to Universal and pitched the idea for adapting it into a movie, despite the fact that, well, obviously, the book was nowhere near finished and only one of the 7 X's had been revealed. With little to no information on when the series was even going to get a sequel released, let alone when it was going to be finished, so Oni Press pulled an anime move and just stampeded into this idea. If you're not familiar with what I mean by anime move, In the Japanese anime and manga industry, it is very common for productions of an anime series to start as soon as the first manga has been released, and this can have different effects on the final product. Sometimes the manga can stop being produced halfway through, other times the anime can be stopped halfway through. Or more commonly known, if the manga is taking a while to be released, they will do the dreaded filler episodes that pad out the series. Dragon Ball Z and the 5 minutes on Namek being the prime example that everyone remembers, and any character Gohan meets in the Saiyan saga that immediately disappears afterwards. Luckily though, Brian Lee O'Malley worked very carefully with Edgar Wright and Michael Bacall to produce several drafts of the script, leading to an exchange of different ideas that would not only help with the development of the film, but would also influence the later volumes of the comics, despite the 6th volume having no bearing on the film as it was in production at this point. When Edgar Wright was brought on board, he had just finished doing a tour to promote Shaun the Dead, so not only did you get an unknown artist, but also a relatively new director, seeing as it wouldn't be until Hot Fuzz that he would get recognised for his talents on a worldwide scale. By the time the script had been finished and casting had begun, only the 4th book had been published, and when filming began in March 2009, the 5th book had only just been released the month before, so anything after the script's final draft would dramatically change. So you can understand how they both became their own entity, which to me is absolutely fine, as both are amazing pieces of media, unless you want 100% both ways. But what exactly are the differences between the two? Seeing as the publishing of the books and the production of the film went hand in hand, and Brian Lee O'Malley worked on both of them simultaneously, the books must diverge at some point. Well, this isn't exactly a Starwind Zone, but you might as well call it the not so Starwind Zone but could be Starwind Zone. Go for it. So before we begin, let's get a timeline up of the book's releases and the film's production stages and see where the line can be drawn together. So first off, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life is released in 2004. The film rights are sold to Universal the same year. In 2005, Michael Bacall joins as co-scriptwriter. Same year, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is released. In 2006, Scott Pilgrim's Infinite Sadness is released. 2007, the script is submitted. Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together is released the same year. 2008, casting begins. 2009, Scott Pilgrim vs. the Universe is released. Then filming begins in Canada a month later. Filming then concludes 5 months later. In April 2010, reshoots are finished. And then in July 2010, Scott Pilgrim's Finest Hour is released, followed by the release of the film. Now in terms of faithful adaptation, Precious Little Life is the closest to this, as the first quarter of the film is almost piece by piece of this volume, aside from a few alternate changes in the film, such as the Battle of the Bands concept as the driving force of the story, Crash and the Boys getting destroyed, Stephen Still's overly anxious nature, and the general abridging of multiple scenes from the comics into one scene to save time. A lot of these minor alterations are for the purpose of minimizing the depth of the comics, so really,
it's not really that big of a deal.
Mission 2, start!
The film is now in the planning stages and the script begins to be written, and this is when the book starts to slowly divide from the film in Volume 2 titled the same name, which concentrates on the fight with Lucas Lee and the slow build up to Envy Adams. So before we go into the nitty gritty, let's look at the fight scene in the film, which is already different, except for the intro and the conclusion, which is pretty much still the same. Lucas Lee isn't actually all that bothered about fighting Scott, and offers to pretend Scott won if he paid him there and then. But after Scott calls him a sellout, Lucas Lee changed his mind, only to be distracted by Scott's next challenge and do a 50-50 grind down the stair rails, which results in the same end as before. The only reason Wallace knows about Lucas Lee in the comics is because he did his research to help Scott train, which just involves watching his films and playing Tony Hawk games, changing him from just a die-hard fan in the film. Between all this, you have the famous garlic bread scene and the haircut conversation, which has no follow-up to them instantly going to Lucas Lee. It all spreads apart in the comic over a matter of days, but in the films, it's quite instant, and as I said before, it's abridged to hit the right points. Another scene, however, appears in this book that doesn't appear until the end of the movie, and that is the fight between Ramona and Knives. In the film, it happens twice in the final boss battle against Gideon, but the actual fight happens when Ramona is hanging around with Stacy Pilgrim and gets ambushed while making a delivery. Later, of course, we get the Envy scene where she calls Scott. In the film, this is abridged with shots that would appear later in the comic to show the relationship, which is very creative, but here it's just a quick back and forth before she invites him and the others to her secret concert to discuss opening for her official concert later on. The comic then finishes just as Envy begins her set, and it's the same as the movie as they both come to the conclusion that Todd is the next X. Now, in terms of the film itself in new bits, it quite early depicts Ramona as the character who just disappears where it gets tough and there is no communication, whereas in the comics there is still the element of mystery about her, but she is very headstrong and won't take any crap, so she is very much present in all these scenes. Another thing that was missed out from the movie is the prequel at the beginning of the book about Scott's high school experiences. However, it was adapted into a prequel animation by Adult Swim to promote the movie. So, I suppose it counts in some way or another, as it uses the same style as the flashbacks in the movie which are in the comic. One thing that they truly missed out in this film though, is Kim's character development, as in this volume it leans heavily on establishing her as a character and her relationship with Scott. I think they missed out a lot of potential to develop her character and instead laid more personality on Stephen Stills, when in the comics he's actually a very serious and deadpan character. But again, this is due to the book's divergence during production.
Mission 3, start!
Infinite Sadness concentrates on Todd Ingram, the vegan psychic who is a direct reference to the character Tetsuo from Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo, especially in the comics, as he talks about him being experimented on when he was young, added with the vegan diet, which gives him the abilities he has, also making reference to Dragon Ball Z with the Super Saiyan hair when he powers up. This volume is pretty much where it ends for the strong comparison to the movie, as although it follows several points of the story, many segments are later transplanted onto later fights, such as with Roxy and Gideon. The fight with Todd spans across several days as we look into Scott's history of envy, the backstory of Todd, including his inability to stay faithful, and throughout the comic just cheats on Envy and manipulates her, while she at the same time is trying to maintain her superstar persona and picking on Ramona for her connection with Gideon and Scott. The first sequence starts out as normal, except for the missing out of one character that plays a small role in the volume, and that's Lynette Guycott, the drummer, the teleporter with a bionic arm who Todd is sleeping with while she does Envy's bidding. But unlike the film that abridges most of the fight, such as the base battle and the ambush by the vegan police, the comic sees it within 3 different days, one involving a race through a shopping mall, causing Todd to go insane and destroy the building for getting lost. This then leads into the third sequence of the fight, and that is the concert that the band is supposed to be opening for. Crash and the boys return as the Boys and Crash, and now have psychic abilities, and Sexbomb come out wearing the outfits that are later used in the Chaos Theatre scene in the film. So already we're jumping back and forth in the comics and film, including the rearrangement of fights, such as how Ramona and Envy fight during the concert, which was replaced with Roxy, creating more variety for each fight without it being samey. I feel at this point they got Ramona and Envy's characters mixed up, as in the comics, soon after Envy's fight with Ramona, it's revealed to her that Todd has been cheating on her, thus resulting in the same setup in the Gideon fight with Ramona, where Envy acts coy towards Todd and then proceeds to knee him in the nuts. This then prompts the base battle, which happens in the film, leading up to the arrival of the vegan police and the headbutt that concludes the chapter. Now, there is even more stuff that happens in the comics, and I've only picked out a few main differences, so if you want more details I would recommend looking into it, but now, on to the next volume.
Mission 4, start!
Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together is where now the line dramatically divides from the film and starts to go in a completely different direction, with very few similarities between the two, other than the introduction of Roxy, Ramona's ex-girlfriend. Roxy of course is introduced in the same way. She tries to ambush Scott and he's having none of it and then she disappears. And that is it for her faithfulness in the comic. Everything else afterwards is completely different when it concerns the fight. Now for everything else there is only one other similarity to the film, and that's the use of the L word, although pushed aside for more comical effect because of the lesbian line. But within this volume it refers to not only Scott's feelings towards Ramona, as by this point they've been dating for a year, but also opens the ideas for sexuality, especially that you find out that some characters are actually curious, like how Knives and Kim drunkenly make out, and Scott finding out that Ramona had a phase as well. So I consider this volume quite complex, especially with its themes of sexuality and relationships, including talking about the testing points of them with the reintroduction to the character of Lisa, who was from Scott's past, and the temptation of being with her after Ramona falls out with him and he has to stay with her. Unlike the few minutes of Roxy in the film, this volume can be very heavy at times when talking about its mature themes, which I can understand couldn't really be explained in a 90-minute film, but my god, if they made a series out of this, they would have to really keep close to this. Of course, we also revisit Scott's past with Knives as her father comes into the fray and tries to kill Scott for what he has done to his daughter, which then tangles into the Roxy situation, leading to the final fight where Scott earns the power of love, unlike in the Gideon fight way later. There are also other aspects of this volume that add to the situation, such as Wars and Scott's tenancy going up on their place and Scott getting a job. So I kinda consider this an enlightenment volume for Scott, unlike in the film that just kinda shoves Roxy in and then moves on like it wasn't a big deal and leaves a very awkward atmosphere with Scott and Ramona.
Mission 5, start!
Scott Pilgrim vs. the Universe is where we say goodbye to the foundations of the movie and head in our own direction. Yes, it does make references such as Sex Bomb's Gig Anxiety, which was used instead for the first battle of the bands in the movie, and this is also the volume where Ramona finds out about Scott's cheating on her with Knives, but this is literally the end of similarities. The two no longer make any comparison in this volume. Scott and Ramona, for starters, are living together. The Katinagi twins are also very prominent in this volume, as they are highly skilled in robotics and use numerous robot baddies against Scott, leading to the final fight in an abandoned building, which is more drawn out to help out with Scott's confidence and to be a better person for Ramona, instead of just being a one-off amp versus amp battle, which makes no sense to me but was still very cool to watch. Can't imagine the feedback from the amps doing very well though for those audiences, must have been horrible. Kim once again returns as a very strong character in this book, developing her relationship with Ramona and Scott, even getting kidnapped at the end by the twins to lure Scott into a fight, before departing to a family home at the end. A lot of the characters dramatically change in this volume, as they're all going through their different pathways, so there isn't a lot of togetherness as friends and more just about being in the same place at the same time because they have to be, normally at a party at Julie's who never stops being a bitch. This then all comes to a head at the end of the volume, where, much like at the end of the twins battle, Ramona just ups and leaves without a word, but instead of going off with Gideon, she teleports full of self-hatred for herself, leaving Scott alone, locked out of the flat, and with only his few remaining friends to turn to. So it's an incredibly frustrating cliffhanger because of how intense the emotions are portrayed throughout, and sadly isn't shown faithfully in the film, where Gideon just turns up, acts nice, steals Ramona, signs up everyone in the band but Scott, and leaves him feeling abandoned. This is a very strong part of the series to me, especially because when I read it, the final book had not been released, so you're just gritting your teeth because you need to know what happens next, which didn't happen until...
Final mission, start!
It is now 2010, and it is only a week before the film is finally released. This is when Scott Pilgrim's finest hour comes out, which was a very weird move to make, which relates to my talk about the anime and manga processes. But this would be the final book in the series, and it is a thick book for that matter, and only a tiny amount can be seen in the movie, but despite that the film manages to hit the same notes as the comic. So let's look at the film first because that is the shortest. So Scott gets a call from Gideon and heads down to the Chaos Sphere to fight him for Ramona, who is by his side. Scott earns the power of love and then soon after dies after Ramona and Knives find out he cheated on them. In the dream world, or what I would consider at this point purgatory, he rekindles with Ramona and realises he has an extra life. He revives, goes back, earns the power of self-respect, and then kicks Gideon's ass with Knives. Afterwards he faces off with his nega self, gets back with Ramona, and they go off into the sunrise together. Now, how much of this is in the comic, and what is different? Well, in terms of similarities, yes, Nega Scott is in this, but he appears way earlier in the book before the fight. The fight does take place at the Chaos Theatre though, and with Scott's death, the new sword enhancement, the death of Gideon, and the restart of Scott and Ramona's relationship, that is it. The rest is completely different. The comic concentrates heavily on Scott finding his place in the world he's been left alone in. It has been several months, he's living alone, the band is over, he isn't hanging around with anyone, and he's in a constant state of paranoia that Gideon will just jump out and kill him when he least expects it. He bumps into his old partners and awkwardly tries to get with them to comedic effect, until the finale of what I consider part 1 of the book, where when visiting Kim, it all comes together and he faces off against his nega self, which is the manifestation of all the mistakes he's made and tried to forget, and upon accepting his mistakes, Nega Scott's absorbed into him and he sets off to fight Gideon as a new man. Part 2 sees the battle of Gideon, who is now dating Envy as she headlines for the Chaos Theatre rather than the sex bombs in the film. When the fight begins, Gideon realizes that he is no longer with Ramona and offers him a position in the League, which is rejected and leads to Scott's death by his own sword. Ramona then appears and explains that she has been staying with her dad and joins the battle against Gideon, which involves a ton of blood and crazy plot points about how Gideon manipulated the subspace to mess with their relationship and wants to add Ramona to his frozen gallery of ex-girlfriends, which becomes very extreme to the point of a giant demon Gideon fight climaxing the final battle of the volume, before everything turns back to normal and everyone relaxes back into their normal lives, excluding a few people like Stephen Stills, who is now gay, Knives moving away, and Scott and Kim starting a new band, all resulting in the final shot similar to the film of Ramona and Scott walking into subspace together and to the future. Now of course when this volume was being made, the film was pretty much near completion, and they had to come up with their own ending, resulting in many different ideas being passed around by writer Bacall. One of these examples was Scott being a psychopath and straight up murdering these people, but there was one that actually made it to the final stage, and that was the one that saw Scott deciding to get back together with Knives and continue life as it was before it all happened. This ending was originally going to be in the final cut of the movie and was filmed and completed just a few months before release, and you can find it online and on the DVDs. You know, because we don't have to keep everything behind lock and key for everyone to ponder over for decades. Thankfully, in a wonderful turn of events, the test audiences didn't connect with the ending and actually didn't want it, which was a brilliant conclusion to come to, because when I saw the film and noticed where it was going, I was about to F-bomb the whole cinema, especially with how the comics ended. Although yes, Scott at the end of it all learns about self-respect, there would be no point in him beating Gideon only to ditch Ramona for Knives. If he wanted to do that, he would have just gone off with her and left Gideon to it. In the comic, he earns the power of understanding after putting all the pieces together with Ramona and Gideon, which wouldn't have happened if Ramona wasn't there, and if she wasn't, it would have been a totally different outcome. Scott isn't an ordinary hero. His whole reason for fighting the League is for selfish means because he wants to be with Ramona. If given the choice, he would have just ran off in the other direction if it was easier. I understand in the film, the first time round he's like, because I'm in love with her, and then the second time it's because he wants to do it for himself, but it's a bit odd to suddenly switch his feelings to Knives after proclaiming so much. Even if he learns the self-respect route, his feelings are still there because of how intense the whole thing was. Gideon doesn't even pose that much of a threat in the movie, especially when we are first introduced to him. He actually doesn't care if he fights Scott or not, he just wants Ramona, which he succeeds in doing. Only when Scott turns up he's like, oh yeah, I should probably deal with this now. Whereas in the comics, Gideon is just as much out for Scott's head as anyone. It's a lot more intense because he's worked so hard to get to this point, he is going to win regardless of where Ramona is. These two depictions are polar opposites to each other and both affect the rhythm of the film's build-up, and give Scott two different purposes for going to him. In the film, it's the damsel in distress gimmick, and in the comic, it's the final showdown to conclude the journey, with the only prize being the satisfaction of finishing. It is until Ramona returns that it becomes about her again. At the end of the day, I don't know. Maybe the reasoning for all these things is because of the complications involving making a film and a comic at the same time. Maybe it's because the film doesn't have time to flesh out the characters as well as we like, and just wanted to make an action rom-com. It honestly doesn't matter all that much. I love both versions and have given exception to what happened, only because of those circumstances. However, if the books had been all out and they made the film like this, yes, I would be very critical for it. But all I can say is, maybe going via the anime route to production isn't the wisest idea in future, because making a film from a property that hasn't even been finished kinda makes it suffer in the long run. If you want a particular order to check these out, I would start with the comic first and then watch the film. It is really the better product, not because of preference of source versus adaptation, but because it's funnier, more in-depth, and very relatable, especially if you're in your late teens, early 20s. Also, read the original black and white editions. Despite there being colour versions, there are more meta jokes about the lack of colour in the original, which adds to the humour. If you don't fancy that though, then I would highly recommend you watch the film instead. It is equally as entertaining and stands very strongly on its own, and I have watched it a ton of times. It's really that good of a film. Now, there is one more piece of media related to this that I will be having a look at later this month, and that is the game that was released the same day as the film on the PS3 and Xbox 360, so be sure to check that out soon. And that is my in-depth review of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World vs. the comic. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy all the other videos on my channel, as I'll be back later in the month with a brand new video, as I said before. But until then though, I have been Nick Starwind, you have been my audience, and remember to like, share, subscribe, stick it on a badger, attach it to a brick, mail it to a bomb and take it by surprise, and hopefully there'll be something left of that bomb to check out my channel. And remember to also spare me some change, governor, in the links below, and I shall see you next time.